great conference so far. I've really enjoyed all the talks, and I think my talk will follow on quite nicely from the previous one. So there's some shared interests and themes. I'm going to share screen now and play a pre-recorded presentation of my talk. Kant is well known for a remarkably strict conception of natural science, or proper natural science, as he calls it in the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science. A proper natural science is systematically unified, ordered by rational principles, and known with apodictic certainty. But Kant's account of proper natural science also raises a problem, and that is that there turn out to be surprisingly few such sciences, one science to be precise, and that is physics. But at the same time, Kant is deeply interested in a large variety of different kinds of disciplines that he himself regards as sciences in some sense. And here are some examples. So for instance, in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant assumes the scientific status of chemistry when he uses distinctively chemical examples to illustrate the ideas that guide scientific inquiry. And similarly, in the Critique of Judgment, Kant implicitly takes for granted that biology is a science when he argues that biological teleology pertains to the methods of science. And then in the Metaphysical Foundations itself, Kant leaves room for a notion of science that may include not only chemistry, but also empirical psychology. And so the question is, how can we make sense of these assertions against the background of Kant's strict conception of proper science? Now, in the literature, commentators have focused their scrutiny on Kant's conception of proper natural science, but they have paid much less attention to the question of whether Kant may be assuming a more inclusive and broader conception of natural science, and if so, what that conception might consist in. And I think that this narrow focus actually makes it very hard to understand and situate Kant's claims about science. So what I want to do in this talk is argue that we have to understand Kant's conception of proper natural science in the context of a broader notion that Kant develops. And what I'm going to argue is that according to this broader notion, both proper and improper natural sciences are genuine kinds of sciences. Now, I don't want to simply propose that Kant develops a broad notion that subsumes his conception of proper natural science as a proper subset. I want to argue more specifically that according to Kant's broad notion of improper science, that according to Kant's broad notion, all improper science is a form of genuine science because it has an important normative relation to science proper. So here's the claim. My proposal is that not all science is proper natural science, but all science ought to be proper natural science. So the idea is that there are other sciences than the proper natural sciences, but they are only sciences insofar as they seek to attain proper scientific status. They seek to attain the status of a science that is systematically unified, ordered according to rational principles, and known with apodictic certainty. So that's my claim. Here's the plan for the talk. In the first part of the talk, I'm going to give a sketch of Kant's contrast between proper and improper natural science that he presents in the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations. In part 2, I'm then going to look at 2 readings that I find in the literature that I think are both problematic. And in the third part of my talk, I'm going to present my own alternative reading, which I call the normative reading, and which I think fares better. So here we go, part 1, proper and improper natural science. Now, in the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations, this contrast between proper and improper natural science emerges as the third of 3 increasingly demanding characterizations of science that Kant presents. Here's the first. According to Kant's first characterization, systematicity is the fundamental mark of science. I quote, "Every doctrine if it is supposed to be a system that is a whole of cognition ordered according to principles, is called a science. So systematicity is unity under principles, and it is what distinguishes science from non-science. Or as Kant puts it in the Critique of Pure Reason, for instance, what distinguishes scientific cognition from ordinary cognition. Now, I think it's striking that in the passage I quoted, here it is again, Kant doesn't characterize as science those doctrines that are systematic, but instead he argues that the title science applies to any doctrine that is supposed to be a system. Now, why Kant uses this apparently normative formulation isn't clear at this point, but it's something I want to come back to in part 3 of my talk. But for now, let's move on to the second characterization Kant presents in the preface. Now, he goes on to argue that we can order cognitions, in particular the cognitions of nature, according to different principles. And here are the two kinds of principles that he distinguishes: the historical or classificatory, and rational or explanatory principles. And corresponding to these two kinds of principles, Kant argues, we can also then distinguish between two kinds of natural science. So we would have historical and rational natural sciences depending on which principles they use to systematize cognition. For example, on Kant's account, Linnaean taxonomy classifies natural things in accordance with similarities. So Linnaean taxonomy uses purely classificatory principles. By contrast, Newtonian physics explains the movements of matter by means of universal laws of motion. It explains, it doesn't just classify, and it does so by means of rational principles, but which Kant characterizes as principles of ground and consequence. So Kant distinguishes between two kinds of science, two kinds of natural science, historical and rational natural sciences. Now moving on to Kant's third characterization, he comes to the distinction between proper and improper natural science. The claim here is that only sciences that are ordered exclusively according to a priori principles can be known with apodictic certainty. So only those natural sciences are natural sciences in the proper sense. By contrast, natural sciences that also contain empirical principles, even if they are rational principles, that is, principles of ground and consequence, if they are merely empirical, they can only ever be known with empirical certainty, and therefore are only sciences improperly so-called. So here's the quote: natural science, Kant says, would be either properly or improperly so-called natural science, where the first treats its object wholly according to a priori principles, the second according to laws of experience. What can be called proper science is only that whose certainty is apodictic. Cognition that can contain mere empirical certainty is only knowledge improperly so-called. So, for instance, the a priori laws of mechanics can explain the movements of the planets with apodictic certainty. That is why Newtonian physics is a proper natural science. But the empirical laws of chemistry, on Kant's account, deliver explanations that may always be revised on the basis of further evidence, and so they are only improper natural sciences. So Kant has given us this characterization of proper natural science by gradually delineating a more and more restrictive notion of science. And I've got an illustration of that here. So he first characterizes science as systematic cognition, then delimits rational natural science as a part that isn't just systematic cognition, but systematic cognition under rational principles. And then within that, proper natural science is that kind of cognition that is ordered by rational principles that we can know a priori, and therefore with apodictic certainty. That looks like a very neat picture, but the preface also contains textual passages that shed doubt on the stability of the kinds of distinctions that Kant has now presented us with. So I want to look at two such complications in particular. Here's the first. So far, and maybe it helps to go back to the image for a moment. So far, according to Kant's characterizations, both historical and rational disciplines count as natural sciences. But Kant also says that only rational disciplines count as natural sciences, while historical ones constitute mere doctrines of nature. Now, the reason for his saying so is that he thinks the concept of nature itself contains reference to lawfulness. Nature is lawful, and therefore any science of nature ought to be concerned with knowledge of such laws. So here's the quote. The word nature, Kant says, since this signifies a derivation of the manifold belonging to the existence of things from their inner principle, makes necessary a cognition through reason of the interconnection of natural things, insofar as this cognition is to deserve the name of science. So a science of nature should be concerned with the cognition of natural phenomena from their inner principles, but historical doctrines do not contain laws that constitute such inner principles, and therefore, Kant argues, they cannot constitute genuine sciences of nature. And so it looks as if our image shrinks. Sciences are only those that are rational, that contain rational principles. But there's a second problem, a second complication, and that is that in some passages, Kant even refuses to give the title science to any doctrine of nature, even a rational one, that is not grounded in a priori principles. So, for instance, he claims that chemistry should be called a systematic art rather than a science, since it is grounded in empirical laws and therefore fails to meet the definition of a science proper. And he says something similar about empirical psychology. So Kant then suggests here that for something to be a science at all, it must be grounded in principles that we can know a priori and with apodictic certainty. And so now it looks as if science shrinks even further to the domain of proper natural science only. Now, these complications introduce, I think, a tension into the preface that any satisfactory reading of the proper-improper distinction has to address. And in the next part of my talk, I'm going to suggest that the two kinds of readings I find in the literature do not address this tension adequately. So here we go, part two problematic readings. Now, I identified two broad trends among philosophers who have commented on Kant's distinction between proper and improper natural science, at least in the most recent literature. Here's the first, which I call the demarcation reading, because it argues that proper natural science is the only possible natural science. So proper natural science is what demarcates science from any other kind of cognition that is not scientific. And I find this reading in Michael Friedman, in a variety of his works, but in particular in his discussion of chemistry, but also in Jennifer mentioned John Zamito, who made claims to this effect in the discussion of Kant's conception of the life sciences. And so on this conception, science is proper natural science. That is the demarcation reading. Now, the demarcation reading has the great advantage that it ascribes to Kant a single conception of natural science. But the disadvantage is that it doesn't explain how to resolve the tension between this single notion and Kant's more inclusive conception that comes through in the texts that I have cited, and that comes through, for instance, also in these passages where Kant says that any whole of cognition that is systematic can for this reason already be called science. And even, he says this even though in some of these wholes, as in chemistry, for instance, the laws from which the given facts are explained through reason are mere laws of experience. So there seem to be sciences, genuine sciences, that contain only empirical principles. Now, a natural way to resolve the tension that I've highlighted may consist in distinguishing between two senses of the term science or natural science, one broad, ranging over both proper and improper natural science, the other strict, limiting science to natural science proper. So according to a second reading, the contrast between proper and improper science turns out not to demarcate science from non-science, but to classify natural sciences into two distinct kinds. And I call this the classification reading. On this reading, there are two distinct but equally genuine kinds of natural sciences, proper and improper. I find claims to this effect in Eric Watkins, in Thomas Sturm, and Bennett McNulty's work. What I should say here is that I don't think these are worked out positions, but background assumptions that we often find in commentators who attribute to Kant a philosophy of the special sciences. So that's the broad trend, I'd say, the second broad trend. And we can illustrate it in this way. Perhaps we have proper natural science, and then we have the improper natural sciences that are just another class of science. Now, the classification reading has the advantage that it avoids charging Kant with a contradiction. Kant can exclude chemistry from the domain of natural science in the strict sense, while also ascribing to chemistry scientific status in the broad sense. But the classification reading faces a considerable difficulty, and that is that I think on the classification reading, it's unclear why improper sciences are genuine sciences at all. And why is that? Well, that is because on the classification reading, what distinguishes improper science from proper science is that it is not grounded in necessary laws that are known with apodictic certainty. But remember the first complication I mentioned before. The science of nature on Kant's account must be concerned with the cognition of natural phenomena according to their inner principles. That is, in accordance with their inner laws, their necessary laws. So Kant cannot allow for a conception of genuine natural science that is independent of the demand for necessary laws. But I think that precisely such an independence is implied by the classification reading. So as I said, to be fair to the interpreters that I mentioned as proponents of the classification reading, they have remained silent on the nature of such independence because they haven't proposed the classification reading as a worked out position. So what might they say about the relationship between improper science and knowledge of the inner principles of natural phenomena? Well, perhaps some might say that the metaphysical nature of the objects of study of the improper sciences is such that they cannot even in principle be grounded in necessary laws. Some might say that about biology, for instance. Others, by contrast, might argue that improper natural sciences can, at least in principle, sometime in the future, achieve proper scientific status. So, for instance, I've argued that biology, even though it doesn't have natural law, it doesn't have necessary laws on Kant's account, Kant leaves open the possibility that we may discover laws that are genuinely biological laws. Either way, I think that either of these answers would put pressure on the classification reading. Whether a natural science is improper because it can never in principle achieve a priori knowledge, or because it has not yet achieved it, but may do so in the future, the science would, I think, be sufficiently disconnected from the demand for a priori knowledge of necessary laws. And so it would not be clear why the improper sciences might count as genuine natural sciences. So that, I think, is the problem with the classification reading. So in my view, both the classification and the demarcation reading are problematic. And in the third and final part of my talk, I now want to argue that the normative reading does better on both counts. So here we go, part 3, an alternative reading. So on my reading, Kant construes both proper and improper natural science as genuine kinds of science. So in this regard, I side with the classification reading against the demarcation reading. But by contrast with the classification reading, I argue that improper natural science is essentially linked to the criteria of proper natural science. And I argue that this link is normative, while the improper natural sciences do not actually fulfill the criteria of proper natural science, they ought to fulfill them. Improper natural science is legitimately called science, and this is what I put on this slide. Improper natural science is a genuine natural science because it is normatively guided by the criteria of proper natural science. And one might illustrate this position through this image, both the sciences that are the historical and the rational but empirical sciences are genuine sciences because they are normatively related. They strive or seek to attain the status of proper natural sciences. That's what the arrows are supposed to illustrate. Now, my reading takes its cue from Kant's surprising normative claim that I flagged at the beginning of the talk. So in the preface, Kant claims that every doctrine, if it is supposed to be a system, that is, a whole of cognition ordered according to principles, is called a science. Now, in the preface, Kant doesn't explain why he regards this normative relation as important, and I think it's no surprise that Kant doesn't explain it. Kant doesn't explain it because he has already explained it in the Critique of Pure Reason. So it's in the Critique of Pure Reason, I argue, that Kant shows that the normative relation to systematicity implies a normative demand to fulfill the criteria of a proper science. Systematicity, grounding in rational principles, and apodictic certainty. And I think that it's this first critique conception that Kant assumes in the preface to the Metaphysical Foundations. So let me say a few words about the account I find in the Critique of Pure Reason. First, well, Kant argues in the Critique of Pure Reason that science requires systematicity. I want to highlight 3 aspects of this account. So first, it's a central insight, I think, of Kant's first critique account that the systematicity required for science is brought about by reason, which is guided by the idea of complete systematicity. So this idea, here's a quote from the appendix of the Transcendental Dialectic. This idea postulates complete unity of the understanding's cognitions. So according to Kant, this is a regulative idea. It doesn't apply to anything we can cognize, but it nevertheless guides our cognitive activities, which means that reason's activity of systematizing cognitions under a principle is always guided by the demand for complete systematicity. And this demand isn't satisfied unless, other than by a complete systematic unity of cognitions. So any achievement of systematicity in science stands under the continued demand for complete systematicity. That is what the idea of reason demands. That is its sort of normative pole. Second, that's the second claim I want to draw out from the Critique of Pure Reason. The idea of complete systematic unity of cognition applied to cognitions of nature is the idea of unity under rational or explanatory principles. So although reason may well be involved in classifying natural objects, it's ultimately after uncovering the conditions of things and therefore after explanation. So for instance, in the appendix, Kant gives this example that reason is involved in classifying materials into earths and salts and combustibles, water and air. But it does so, and I quote, in order to explain the chemical effects of those materials. So reason's guiding idea, the idea of complete unity of cognitions, is therefore an idea of unity under explanatory principles or laws. And here is another passage from the appendix. The idea postulates complete unity of the understanding's cognition, through which this cognition comes to be not merely a contingent aggregate, but a system interconnected in accordance with necessary laws. Now, if we had fully determined knowledge of this, that's the continuation of the quote I gave earlier, and it shows that what Kant means by this idea of complete systematicity is an idea of complete systematicity under rational principles or laws. Now, here's the third point I want to draw out from the first critique conception, and that is that the idea of reason is also the idea of the complete unity of cognitions under laws that can be known a priori, and therefore with apodictic certainty. So the point here is that reason, according to Kant's first critique conception, isn't only after a sort of rational, inferentially ordered system of cognitions, it's also after certainty, and Kant expresses this in the Architectonic of Pure Reason when he argues that I understand by a system the unity of the manifold cognitions under one idea. And this idea is the concept of reason, of the form of a whole, insofar as through it, through the concept, the domain of the manifold as well as the position of the parts with respect to each other is determined a priori. So the idea here is that we have to understand a system as a system under an idea. And if we had fully determinate knowledge of this idea, we would be able to infer a priori not only the domain of the manifold, that is all the cognitions that are part of the system, but also their position vis-a-vis each other, that is the principles that govern their relations. So we would know the system and its ordering principles a priori, and therefore with apodictic certainty. So in seeking systematic unity under rational principles, reason is therefore also guided by an idea of systematic unity that can be known a priori and with apodictic certainty. So those are the three aspects of the first critique conception I wanted to bring out. And so what we get then in the first critique is an account according to which science requires the systematic unity brought about by reason, but reason is guided by the regulative idea of complete systematic unity. Let's call it the norm of complete systematic unity, which in turn implies the norms of ordering under rational principles and knowledge, apodictic certainty, knowledge that is apodictically certain of those principles. So what I want to suggest then is that Kant's conception of science in the first critique implies my normative reading. It shows why improper science is a genuine form of science. It's a genuine form of science because it is normatively guided by the criteria of proper natural science: full systematicity, rational ordering, and apodictic certainty. Now let me now turn back to the metaphysical foundations. I think there's there's clear evidence that here too, in the metaphysical foundations too, Kant assumes the first critique conception of science. After introducing the distinction between proper and improper science, Kant adds that one can easily see, and I quote, that in accordance with demands of reason, every doctrine of nature must finally lead to natural science and conclude there. Now, Kant makes this claim after arguing that natural science derives the legitimacy of its title from its pure part. So in this context, Kant refers by natural science to proper natural science. And so he suggests that any doctrine of nature, in accordance with demands of reason, must strive to become a proper science. I read the must here in this quote as the must of the necessary demands of reason. And so I think that in the metaphysical foundations, just as in the first critique, Kant maintains that for something to count as science in the broad sense, it must seek to realize what reason demands. It must seek to realize proper natural science. So this is where I want to conclude. I want to conclude that Kant presents a well-defined, broad conception of natural science that ranges over natural science proper and improperly so-called. A body of cognition on this conception qualifies as a natural science in the broad sense if it stands in a normative relation to natural science proper. So Kant can then consistently hold that there's a wide class of cognition that may legitimately be called science, even if it doesn't qualify as natural science proper, while also maintaining that these improper natural sciences are supposed to have, ought to have proper scientific status. He can, without contradiction, claim that not all sciences do in fact explain the phenomena within their domain in terms of necessary laws, while also arguing that all sciences aim for such explanation. So even in the text that is known for its strict and even restrictive notion of science, Kant, I want to conclude, is deeply committed to this broad normative conception of science as a central human activity. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.